So, as I said, I'm Cassandra Drotman with SCS Engineers, and we'll be going over California's low carbon fuel standard program and Ohio opportunities and how they might be available and pertain to your region. The low carbon fuel standard, LCFS as it's called, is really applicable anywhere in the continental United States, and how it can be implemented, and you could help or join California's program, receive credits. There is a monetary value to them. So it's not just to make green gas, RNG, other biofuels, but there is a market and a value to them, which we'll go over as well. As you'll see, we'll go over the main program, the different sectors. This presentation is mostly focused for the solid waste industry. There are other sectors and requirements that will be listed, but I'll go over those quickly unless there's more questions on them. How the market, what the market is and the opportunities in Ohio are. So the low carbon fuel standard, it's really looked at as one of California's greenhouse gas reduction measures. It's part of AB 32, which came out in 2006, which has a dozen or so sectors in it which to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they have mandatory reporting for greenhouse gases in California, similar to federal, but there's more requirements, more industries, more data is collected based from the federal greenhouse gas requirements. Then there's an offset program for your general offset programs. There's a landfill methane rule, which is a more stringent version of NSPS. And one of these programs is also the low carbon fuel standard. So instead of looking directly at your total greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation industry, they look at the carbon intensity of each fuel that's being used and rank them in that manner. When reporting, you can then take the carbon intensity of the fuel and times it by the quantity of fuel being used, and that is and calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. So when looking at everything, we'll be talking about the carbon intensity and how it interacts with the total transportation fuel use that's being used in California. And looking at changing from high carbon intensity CI fuels to a low carbon CI fuel, which ideally would reduce our petroleum dependency and achieve air quality benefits. So in California, and you could mirror this out to most of the United States, the transportation sector is responsible for 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see. This, and so when looking at how to reduce California's emissions, they first looked at large stationary sources, similar to the federal rule. Those are all tied into cap and trade. And then they said, well, half of emissions are from greenhouse gas emissions. So how can we reduce those? They came up with this program. First came out in 2009. As you can see, it's been adopted multiple times to add additional sectors. There's a refinery sector, to add different programs. In 2018, the most recent one, they added a verification validation program, which if you have projects for lower intensity fuels, they need to be validated, verified by a third party to ensure accuracy and that what's being reported is the true number. The goal, as I said, is to reduce the carbon intensity of the transportation sector by 20% by 2030, and the most recent amendment aims to be carbon neutral by 2045. So the benchmark for the carbon intensity is for gasoline and diesel, as those are the two main transportation fuels that are used. Those are what the rule was primarily based to set the benchmark for. And then each year it reduces the carbon intensity benchmark by users using more renewable fuels. Now for the reporting under the rule, it's not, Bob and Jane and everyone who's driving a car who's reporting. It is the transportation fuel suppliers who are reporting. And depending on the fuel that's doing it, it's the larger fuel supplier who's importing the fuel from out of state into California, so from Texas or abroad, or even local producers within California, or for renewable fuels, it's the renewable fuel developer, so who owns and operating the project and is injecting RNG into the pipeline and somewhere in the United States. They would be reporting because they would be getting the credit.
Hi, Cassandra.
Yes.
Is it the CI is per 1,000 joules or million joules?
Sorry, the
million joules, right?
it's in 1,000 megajoules. And so for the different fuels, it's who's reporting them does vary on the sector. For the alternative fuels, renewable fuels, biofuels, it is the developer who is selling, processing, creating, and selling that fuel, and they get the credits. But how the market is created is you have you have generators and who are creating credits, and then you have the suppliers who are creating deficits, and it creates the market between it. And the CI is measured in gram CO2e per megajoule. So here you'll see the benchmarks starting in 2019 and going forward. You'll see them for gasoline and diesel, as I said, and you'll see how they lower. And so the idea is that more renewable options are being used, new technology is created in order to meet these benchmarks. Now, these benchmarks are required to be met by the transportation fuel suppliers, the deficit creators, who are the main importers supplying the gasoline, diesel at gasoline stations for transportation use. Fuels that are not used for transportation use or exported from California are used for marine, aviation, federal uses. Those are exempt from the rule. There are a lot of exemptions from the rule for anyone who does not qualify as California transportation. Red diesel is exempt, and similar things. So here's the trajectory showing where we've started, and then the direction it's going. So we're still in the beginning of the program. It is slated through 2030 with an extension to 2045. So as you can see, we're slowly increasing the amount of renewable fuels. Besides, a lot of the big initial push has been for renewable diesel and swapping out for petroleum diesel as their equivalent. It is a technology change isn't required, so there's been a big push there, mixing biodiesel in that sector. There's also been a big push in fleets changing to CNG in the municipal sector, in the solid waste sector and the municipal sector, based off of landfill ownage and looking at what's available and what they're familiar with. And a lot of fleets are already CNG fleets, so switching from natural gas to renewable natural gas has been at one of the earlier components of the program.
Cassandra?
Yes.
Just a question. The Republic Waste Systems just announced that they were going to go to fuel cells and hydrogen fuels. And I know that California has many stations now that are being put in for green hydrogen. What can you tell us about that fuel? I can see it at the bottom of the next this slide. What's the status there? Because Republic's committed to doing that, and that there are no emissions that come out of a fuel cell vehicle.
Yes. So for the hydrogen and fuel cell usage, those each have a sector in the LCFS program, and those, instead of calculating the CI intensity of the fuel like you would do for RNG project, It's calculated separately. You would report that, you would register it and report it with the state, with the LCFS program in California, and you would get credit for it. For those the fueling has to be done in California for California transportation. So for Republic, per se, it would only be applicable to their California fueling station and abilities. You can, versus other projects, if you made the hydrogen out of state, you'd have to get it, in state for fueling. And I'll explain how some of that works. It's much easier for RNG because you just have to show that it is transported via pipeline or could make it from being injected in Ohio to California. And you do a mass balance calculating of this much was injected versus into a pipeline, this much was fueled, and you show the ownership of the fuel. It doesn't actually physically have to make it to California. For compressed hydrogen, there's no nationwide pipeline, so you'd have to physically get the fuel there.
Thank you.
Okay. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there are multiple sectors and fuels that need to report. Here are some of them. Now for the California gasoline, diesel, any fossil fuels, those are biofuels, they're all required to be reported under the regulation. For some of the renewable fuels or smaller fuels that aren't used as much, there's thresholds that you have to meet or you can decide to opt in. So like propane is currently an opt-in fuel until 2021, at which point you have to meet a threshold to be selling over 150,000 gallons a year per station to qualify. So there are things that, not everything listed necessarily will have to report. Hydrogen is an example of that. You'd just decide to opt in to the program. Now as a hydrogen station, there's only a benefit for you because you're offsetting the traditional deficit fuels of gasoline and diesel. But it's not required that you mandatorily report, but you would have a benefit and be able to generate credits for that, which we'll go over the price in shortly. So you'll see, besides just the standard fuels that most people think of, any fuel gasoline that's blended with more than 10% ethanol, fuel blended with biomass, with diesel, and the list, there's a bunch of them. So most people aren't using, neat biofuel, but they are using, as I said, a lot of fueling stations are switching to selling renewable diesel 100%, and they don't even label it that, they just sell it as diesel because it's chemically the same compound, even though one is manufactured from renewable sources. Alternative jet fuel. So as I said, the aviation industry is exempt from the rule, but they can opt in to partake as well. Propane and any other non-liquid or liquid fuels are able to report under the rule. So for reporting, there's deficit generating members who are required to report, and this is really calculating the greenhouse gas emissions associated with gasoline and diesel and some of those other fuels you saw listed, but primarily those two as the main transportation fuels. They're required to report quarterly to CARB, as well as for crude oil quarterly. And then there's also annual reports. Starting in 2021, there is a verification requirement for these reports. So this would be people like Shell, ExxonMobil, Musket, anyone you go to the normal gas station to fuel, they're all reporting, not per gas station necessarily, but what the amount of fuel that is going into the California market. And this just shows some of what's being reported and needs to be reported. For credit generating, it is reported through the fuel pathway process. So a project such as a landfill in Ohio that is collecting landfill gas and converting it to pipeline quality gas could partake in this project, and they would create their own fuel pathway. You'd be assigned a number, and you'd report annually at a minimum to California what your pathway specific CI score is. There are different tools that are used. There's simplified tools, and then there's called the tier 1. And then if you're a tier 2 category, you'd use the California GREET 3.0 model. They do have models that you insert all your information from the methane content, the total quantity of fuel that is collected, the total quantity of fuel that's cleaned up and injected, the methane content before and after, and a bunch of other data points that you're probably already collecting if you have one of these systems, to come up with the carbon intensity. You calculate it on an annual basis, and then annually you have to re-update the tool to verify and validate that your CI has not changed significantly. If it's changed by over 5%, you have to go through the whole process again and get it approved. If it hasn't changed by that much, then they let you just keep moving forward with the CI that's being used. So that's basically how you calculate it based off your CI score. You then would sell your fuel and calculate the greenhouse gas emissions associated that you're reducing based off of the total credits, and then you would be able to sell those in the market. 1 carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is similar to what's set up in California's cap and trade program, that 1 ton is 1 credit. So that is similar, even though the cap and trade program is a separate market. And the credits between the cap and trade program and the LCFS market are not, you can't switch between them. So here's the current example of certified CI pathways for 2019. You can see, as we looked before, gasoline and diesel were around 91 currently in 2019. You can see I put for bio LNG, bio CNG, that would be a renewable, your RNG, that they're more around 59, 58. One of the issues for landfills is that because they are regulated by NSPS, there is kind of a default negative impact that you get based off how the rule was developed in order to calculate the CI intensity of the gas, because it is looked at as being mandatory, but it is significantly lower than your petroleum fuels. So you do get, there is a lower CI, which would help you reduce from your diesel or propane. As you see though, as the curve went down over time, there would be a point when it wouldn't be as applicable. It would still be considered a renewable fuel. You still wouldn't receive deficits for it, but you wouldn't have that big bang for your buck credit. There's definitely a bigger bang for your buck for dairy RNG, which would put you farther, and they're more around the negative 300, negative 200, which gives you a much lower CI. So that, you know, there's different projects looking at that. There are people looking at doing mixed combined projects between dairies and landfills as well, or grouping digesters and dairies or digester projects. Those have much lower CIs as well. As you can see, there's also the hydrogen is listed here, as well as electricity. So for companies that are looking to switch, reporting for those are slightly different and have different requirements than the solid waste sector would for landfills, but you would still calculate your CI. You can see it's much closer to 0 than what your CARB, which is the gasoline, puts you at. So the simplest way for reporting is, if, for example, for an electricity project, you would just look it up in a lookup table. You'd look at the table, you'd get the CI, you calculate it through, you'd report it to CARB, and you're done. You also do these for your just basic fossil fuels that you see listed. So there's no need to look up what the CI for gasoline is, diesel, because CARB has calculated those. They come out with, they update the regulation, they'll update the table as it goes, but you just look it up. You use a report, nothing else needs to be done for those. Starting in 2021, as I said, verification will be required. So you will be audited to make sure you are using the correct CI, but the actual CI value doesn't need to be audited. Then for the pathways, the next step is the tier 1. It's the most common. This is where you would get your biomethane from landfills, wastewater, dairies, organic waste, digesters, that type of projects. The LCFS program is very interesting because it's not as rigid as other programs where you can develop any type of renewable project, bring it to ARB, and they'll approve it on a project by project basis. So you don't have to meet a set of requirements. However, because it is a new program and CARB is independently approving each project, it does take a little more time, as well as there's a lot more back and forth between CARB and the reporting entity for the pathways. But as I said, the most common one is using the tier 1. They provide you with the calculator. You really just have to put the inputs in, go through the process, and then go through a verification and validation process in order to confirm that your CI is accurate. Now for these, CARB will review, they can approve modifications and things like that, but these are for your basic project types that you see listed. Next, you have the tier 2 pathway, and this is really, as I said, you can create any type of project you want as long as you're creating a renewable fuel in order to reduce emissions. These would also include refinery projects to reduce emissions at a refinery. If you're making the refinery a cleaner cleaner in order to reduce the emissions at the refinery, you can get credits. And there's a few other ways, but it's not as applicable to the solid waste industry. So if you wanted to do a combined landfill digester project, you would do a tier 2 pathway and be able to come up with your own CI, which might be lower than just doing a landfill project. And you might also be able to meet organic waste diversion goals that you've set as well. So you can kind of double dip into, trying to see what you're doing there and get it approved if it doesn't meet one of those other set project types. So for both pathways, as I said, they do now require validation and verification. Once a pathway is created, you do an initial validation to ensure that it's set up correctly, that this what the CI score is, and then annually you're required to get it verified to make sure that you're still meeting those requirements. Initially, for a pathway, you need a minimum of 3 months of data in order to register and get it validated. And then annually, you would be validating the next 12 months worth of data for this, and to confirm the certified CI has not changed significantly over that 5%. Once you can submit a pathway anytime during the year, and then annually the reports are due by March 31st. For the verification, California, all of their programs from mandatory reporting, offset reporting, and low carbon fuel standard, they all require verification. The LCF program is just a little slower to jump into that round. They really want to make sure that the reductions are accurate, and because they are being used in a marketplace, traceable, verifiable, and real. So they really want to show that the CI is real and that it's not being made up or adjusted incorrectly to benefit a party from not doing a project correctly. So for these projects, the validations needed for the pathways, for the renewable fuel sources, as well as for the deficit reporters, they will be doing verification as well. You would hire a third party to do your verification. SCS is an accredited LCFS verifier. Verification company, I'm one of the lead verifiers with the program, as well as we have Ray Huff, and then other staff members. And Ray Huff oversees SCS's Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as well as Patrick Sullivan, who oversees our California business operations, as well as our national air quality expert. And so we're all part of our SCS's team, and we do the verification for the pathways. Because it is new, 2020 is the first year pathways have been able to be verified and required to be verified for new pathways. Once your CI certification is up, anyone who's previously been registered will need to be start the validation verification process as well. You'll just see there's some deadlines. So as I said, for the first one, you have to have a minimum of 3 months data, and then you have to be validated within 6 months. Everyone else is required annually to be verified by August 31st. So you have till March 31st to report, and then August 31st to verify. Most people, once you start reporting, they do it on the calendar basis. When looking at it, the CI, as I said, it's all within a 5% relative threshold, but they also look at 5% difference in the CI, looking at a relative threshold as well as an absolute error threshold. And if it's greater than the 2 gram CO2 per megajoule, these are 2 ways to look at it, when most programs just look at the 5% error. Because you're looking at the CI and the numbers are so small, we look at both thresholds. For verification, there's 3 types of verification. So there's a positive, qualified, positive, and adverse. Basically, if you can't go back in time, and if your flow meter wasn't was out of 5% calibration at the landfill, you can't go back and change that. So it does give you some wiggle room in order to still have your CI approved. It would just have a notation of what the error, non-correctable errors were. An adverse would be that you're just not meeting the regulation requirements. In CARB's other programs, 99% of people get positive verifications. Only a few people normally get qualified positive. I said it's usually for things that you can't go back and fix. You didn't calibrate your meter didn't pass the 5% calibration accuracy, you have missing data that you can't deal with. So there are ways to, still get your CI approved and to be able to use, just with a notation. So the LCFS market, I'm sure you are all interested in this. This is really a billion-dollar market. And it doesn't just impact California. There's projects all over the United States that are being part of this market and being implemented. As you can see, in 2018, it was over 2 billion. In 2019, it was again over 2 billion. Of the 52 entities that reported deficits, they weren't able to buy enough credits in order to get down to meet their deficit total. This has really shown that there is room to grow in the market. And even during the COVID pandemic that we're in, the price of credits has not dropped or changed significantly. There's still really a large demand for these credits. We'll have to see in 2020 how it plays out, because we are using less fuel since people are driving less currently. But how it's currently projected and how the market price hasn't changed. It's still about $200 a credit. As I said earlier, 1 credit is 1 ton CO2 E. So if you could replace that, if you have a landfill, you could easily be generating 100,000 metric tons of CO2e that you're injecting as RNG into a pipeline. And if you get $200 a credit, you can really make a lot of potential money there. Now you do take your CI score and you multiply that out. So it really depends on your landfill's potential, your digester's potential, and things like that. SCS not only is a verifier, but we have SCS Energy, which designs, constructs, builds these types of projects as well. So we've done everything from the permitting to the design, construction, operation, verification of these projects, and I've seen that there is really a marketplace for these. And there's a, I'm sure many of you have seen in the industry, there's a lot of RNG projects being constructed and rebuilt that previously weren't applicable without additional funding. So you can see it's broken down, the credits and the type of fuels. You know, ethanol, as we do use it in gasoline, is a large volume being used. You'll see biodiesel, renewable diesel, and just the quantities being used and what's previously where credits have been generated. So for biomethane, that's where your RNG would fall in with other uses as well. You can see it is one of the top set project pathways that have been generating credits, up at the to build, you know, but for the fuel volume, it's quite large, up almost to 10 million metric tons or 10 million credits in 2018. Now for these credits, it's really the deficit creators who will be buying them, and there's a marketplace set up for that because they're trying to reach a zero carbon intensity by replacing their renewable, replacing petroleum fuels with renewable fuels. And here you can see just how the price has changed, and then the trajectory. So you can even see from 2019 and the beginning of 2020 how it is at the $200 approximate level for credits. And you can see the quantities that are being transacted are significantly increasing. So in Ohio, you do have a large potential, and there are many projects in the state already, which I'll show you. One landfill could have multiple pathways associated with a single system, depending how you're selling and injecting and routing the RNG, LNG to biofuel to California. As I mentioned, the fuel does have to show a final delivery and use in California as a transportation fuel. However, it does not physically have to get there. It just has to show that there is a pipeline pathway there, that it could technically get there. And so you'll see, basically they look at what's injected. You have to be able to prove that there is a physical pipeline in order to get to California. And then you would show that it's being fueled at the station, and basically do a bookkeeping method to show that what's being used. Because you are injecting in one place and using it another place without holding it in a single place, you have 3/4 in order to tie it out of what's being reported. If the fuel's not used as transportation fuel in California within 3/4, then you aren't applicable to get that credit. The CI score would not change though, and you would use that for the entire period based off the total quantity of fuel that's generated and injected, and then the credits would use the CI score times the volume of fuel that is being used, and you would come up with your total credits. So you could use a portion of the fuel in Ohio. You could use directly at the landfill to operate a fleet, and then only sell a portion to California or to different people in California, which would give you different avenues. So I'll show you some examples of that shortly. All the project data is public information and posted on CARB's website. So it's all available for anyone to look at and get. As I said, besides just landfill gas, you could really look at doing joint projects with multiple waste streams. In California, we have large organic reduction goals, which a lot of the country is slowly following and looking at. And so if you wanted to if Ohio has any that you were able to, you know, meet those targets early by reducing your organic stream by doing a digester project. Well, here's somewhere where you can get $200 of credit for implementing a project and say, you know, showing that you're going to sell the biofuel to California, and it could pay for your project versus waiting down line, you know, and coming up with funds another way. This is also for landfills that might need to be NSPS in the near future, but don't have systems yet. You could generate credits that way. It can be, as I said, an NSPS landfill that already has a system you want to do an expansion on early, you know, as long as you have enough gas to make it feasible with the total quantity of fuel. Sorry for the background noise. That is my garbage collection going by this morning. And so there's different ways to look at it. Wastewater landfill, you know, a lot of, in California, I have a few clients who do a combined wastewater landfill digester gas mix to run power plants. There's one in north by San Francisco. So there are different options. Obviously, the facilities have to be close together. The nice thing thinking about digesters before organics is that you can build one directly at your landfill, and you don't need to, or you could have your waste collection, take that material and take it elsewhere versus the landfill if you're having separate collections. So it does give you some different avenue streams. So here in Ohio, here's just some example projects. This says legacy. It means they were done prior to the most current amendment that requires validation, as well as their initial legacy CI score versus their current CI score, which has been certified by ARB. And then currently for their next year for 2021, or if not this year, they would have to get validation as well. And you'll see the category that they're selling in. Most of the landfills will be doing bio-CNG or bio-LNG. And you can see the score, it does vary. Legacy, again, would also be an older project before they came out with the tiers, and would probably fall into tier 1. Most of them will fall into tier 1 just using the landfill tool and not a commingled tool. And I, you know, listed the sites and what type of projects they are. As you can see, all of them are going to be delivered via pipeline. If you're closer to California, there are 1 or 2 projects that you'll see here that a portion of it is trucked in. So it would be piped to, for example, piped to Arizona, and then from Arizona it's trucked into California to Bakersfield or another location. But you really have to make sure that's a feasible option. Just driving biomethane from Ohio would probably be more expensive and time consuming than just doing the pipeline injection. And it wouldn't be feasible. So as you can see, there are a lot of current projects. Now, I'm not as familiar with Ohio landfills, but I'm sure you guys probably would know that these are some of the larger landfills that probably already have gas systems. And so turning it, injecting it, it was going from what they were previously doing to injection isn't a far stretch. And as I said, you know, if you already have a gas system in place, going to pipeline injection it could be an expensive endeavor. However, if you already have the gas system in place, it's much cheaper than starting from scratch, or if you were to try to do a voluntary non-California landfill project. Those credits go for $1 a ton if you're lucky. I know one project that's looking at getting $2 a ton. They used to go for $6 or $7, but if all of a sudden you can get $200 a ton, there's a significant financial incentive there. And you can also see that the CI score is lower than the set point of 90, where we currently are for gasoline and diesel respectively. So those are the current projects that are in Ohio. Now these projects don't just, they can, as I say, can be anywhere in the United States. You just have to register, do the reporting. So there are, of course, additional requirements on top of just having a project, but it's quarterly or annual reporting requirements, as well as going through the validation verification step, and then, you know, determining, you know, finding someone to partner with to sell the fuel in California. Many people are looking at changing and switching this direction. You have current contacts within the solid waste industry in California, you know, with Republic or Waste Management or other solid waste groups who have CNG fleets. You know, it's an easy tie-in way to start. But there's a huge market. A lot of large oil, transportation fuel suppliers are teaming up to help implement this and add CNG fueling at more locations in California. Gas stations all over the state are adding a CNG option based off the rule to make it more applicable, easier to fleet. So there's also an increasement of RNG and other things that are being implemented at new gas stations as well. So just a summary, the program first started in 2009. In 2018, they did add some new requirements and validation, but also added more pathway opportunities to help generate LCFS credits. The verification validation is new, is starting next year. The idea is to reduce California's fuel pool to carbon neutral by 2045, which was extended from the 2030 requirement to just reduce by 20%. And, you know, there's a lot of potential opportunities in the United States and Ohio when you're looking at meeting not only your own goals or creating revenue, but also to reduce organic streams or landfill emissions from just flaring to creating a product. From there, does anyone have any questions?
And Cassandra, I got a question here. We've had, this is Paul Baker from Guild Associates. We manufacture equipment for upgrading. We've had a few questions from customers in regard to sequestering the carbon dioxide from a landfill and then putting that to a different use. Is that you know, I've looked at the fuel pathways and I haven't seen that initiated anywhere. Can you comment about how that would lower the CI score?
There is a project type to do that. It is a little more focused for refineries. So for refineries taking their excess carbon and doing projects for it, because it is a California-based program currently, you know, they're more interested in that. By taking the carbon from a landfill in Ohio and not tying it into the California program, you're potentially missing some of, you know, the California potential for that, reducing the CI score. If you could tie it into how a program into the project, you'd have to make a tier 2 project and demonstrate to CARB how you're reducing the CI of the fuel that's being sent. And if you could do that, then it would be approved.
Okay. I'll at least investigate that.
I think we're about to go back to I think I ran a little over, sorry. You know, shoot me an email and I can send you some more information back.
Okay.